After all, raising healthy offspring is at the very core of our human sense of purpose and meaning. What could drive parents to deliberately hurt or neglect their children? Carlin's research provided me with one answer. Watching her videos, I could see the children becoming more and more inconsolable, sullen, or resistant to their misattuned mothers. At the same time, the mothers became increasingly frustrated, defeated, and helpless in their interactions. Once the mother comes to see the child not as her partner in an attuned relationship, but as a frustrating, enraging, disconnected stranger, the stage is set for subsequent abuse. About 18 years later, when these kids were around 20 years old, Lyons Ruth did a follow-up study to see how they were coping. Infants with seriously disrupted emotional communication patterns with their mothers at 18 months grew up to become young adults with an unstable sense of self, self-damaging impulsivity, including excessive spending, promiscuous sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, and binge eating, inappropriate and intense anger, and recurrent suicidal behavior. Carlin and her colleagues had expected that hostile, intrusive behavior on the part of the mothers would be the most powerful predictor of mental instability in their adult children, but they discovered otherwise. Emotional withdrawal had the most profound and long-lasting impact. Emotional distance and role reversal, in which mothers expected the kids to look after them, were specifically linked to aggressive behavior against self and others in the young adults. Dissociation, knowing and not knowing. Lyons Ruth was particularly interested in the phenomenon of dissociation, which is manifested in feeling lost, overwhelmed, abandoned, and disconnected from the world, and in seeing oneself as unloved, empty, helpless, trapped, and weighed down. She found a striking and unexpected relationship between maternal disengagement and misattunement during the first 2 years of life and dissociative symptoms in early adulthood. Lyons Ruth concludes that infants who are not truly seen and known by their mothers are at a high risk to grow into adolescents who are unable to know and to see. Infants who live in secure relationships learn to communicate not only their frustrations and distress, but also their emerging selves, their interests, preferences, and goals. Receiving a sympathetic response cushions infants and adults against extreme levels of frightened arousal. But if your caregivers ignore your needs or resent your very existence, you learn to anticipate rejection and withdrawal. You cope as well as you can by blocking out your mother's hostility or neglect and act as if it doesn't matter, but your body is likely to remain in a state of high alert, prepared to ward off blows, deprivation, or abandonment. Dissociation means simultaneously knowing and not knowing. Bowlby wrote, "What cannot be communicated to the mother cannot be communicated to the self." If you cannot tolerate what you know or feel what you feel, the only option is denial and dissociation. Maybe the most devastating long-term effect of this shutdown is not feeling real inside, a condition we saw in the kids in the children's clinic and that we see in the children and adults who come to the trauma center. When you don't feel real, nothing matters, which makes it impossible to protect yourself from danger. Or you may resort to extremes in an effort to feel something, even cutting yourself with a razor blade or getting into fistfights with strangers. Carlin's research showed that dissociation is learned early. Later abuse or other traumas did not account for dissociative symptoms in young adults. Abuse and trauma accounted for many other problems, but not for chronic dissociation or aggression against self. The critical underlying issue was that these patients didn't know how to feel safe. Lack of safety within the early caregiving relationship led to an impaired sense of inner reality, excessive clinging, and self-damaging behavior. Poverty, single parenthood, or maternal psychiatric symptoms did not predict these symptoms. This does not imply that child abuse is irrelevant, but that the quality of early caregiving is critically important in preventing mental health problems, independent of other traumas. For that reason, treatment needs to address not only the imprints of specific traumatic events, but also the consequences of not having been mirrored, attuned to, and given consistent care and affection, dissociation and loss of self-regulation. Restoring synchrony. Early attachment patterns create the inner maps that chart our relationships throughout life, not only in terms of what we expect from others, but also in terms of how much comfort and pleasure we can experience in their presence. I doubt that the poet E.E. Cummings could have written his joyous lines, "I like my body when it is with your body, muscles better and nerves more," if his earliest experiences had been frozen faces and hostile glances. Our relationship maps are implicit, etched into the emotional brain and not reversible simply by understanding how they were created. You may realize that your fear of intimacy has something to do with your mother's postpartum depression, or with the fact that she herself was molested as a child, but that alone is unlikely to open you to happy, trusting engagement with others. However, that realization may help you to start exploring other ways to connect in relationships, both for your own sake and in order to not pass on an insecure attachment to your own children. In Part 5, I'll discuss a number of approaches to healing damaged attunement systems through training in rhythmicity and reciprocity. Being in sync with oneself and with others requires the integration of our body-based senses: vision, hearing, touch, and balance. If this did not happen in infancy and early childhood, there is an increased chance of later sensory integration problems, to which trauma and neglect are by no means the only pathways. Being in sync means resonating through sounds and movements that connect, which are embedded in the daily sensory rhythms of cooking and cleaning, going to bed and waking up. Being in sync may mean sharing funny faces and hugs, expressing delight or disapproval at the right moments, tossing balls back and forth, or singing together. At the Trauma Center, we have developed programs to coach parents in connection and attunement, and my patients have told me about many other ways to get themselves in sync, ranging from choral singing and ballroom dancing to joining basketball teams, jazz bands, and chamber music groups. All of these foster a sense of attunement and communal pleasure. Chapter 8, Trapped in Relationships, the Cost of Abuse and Neglect. The Night Sea journey is the journey into the parts of ourselves that are split off, disavowed, unknown, unwanted, cast out, and exiled to the various subterranean worlds of consciousness. The goal of this journey is to reunite us with ourselves. Such a homecoming can be surprisingly painful, even brutal. In order to undertake it, we must first agree to exile nothing. Stephen Cope. Marilyn was a tall, athletic woman in her mid-30s who worked as an operating room nurse in a nearby town. She told me that a few months earlier, she started to play tennis at her sports club with a Boston fireman named Michael. She usually steered clear of men, she said, but she had gradually become comfortable enough with Michael to accept his invitations to go out for pizza after their matches. They'd talk about tennis, movies, their nephews and nieces, nothing too personal. Michael clearly enjoyed her company, but she told herself he didn't really know her. One Saturday evening in August, after tennis and pizza, she invited him to stay over at her apartment. She described feeling uptight and unreal as soon as they were alone together. She remembered asking him to go slow, but had very little sense of what had happened after that. After a few glasses of wine and a rerun of Law and Order, they apparently fell asleep together on top of her bed. At around 2 a.m, Michael turned over in his sleep. When Marilyn felt his body touch hers, she exploded, pounding him with her fists, scratching and biting, screaming, "You bastard, you bastard." Michael, startled awake, grabbed his belongings and fled. After he left, Marilyn sat on her bed for hours, stunned by what had happened. She felt deeply humiliated and hated herself for what she had done, and now she'd come to me for help in dealing with her terror of men and her inexplicable rage attacks. My work with veterans had prepared me to listen to painful stories like Marilyn's without trying to jump in immediately to fix the problem. Therapy often starts with some inexplicable behavior: attacking a boyfriend in the middle of the night, feeling terrified when somebody looks you in the eye, finding yourself covered with blood after cutting yourself with a piece of glass, or deliberately vomiting up every meal. It takes time and patience to allow the reality behind such symptoms to reveal itself. Terror and numbness. As we talked, Marilyn told me that Michael was the first man she'd taken home in more than 5 years, but this was not the first time she'd lost control when a man spent the night with her. She repeated that she always felt uptight and spaced out when she was alone with a man, and there had been other times when she'd come to in her apartment, cowering in a corner, unable to remember clearly what had happened. Marilyn also said she felt as if she was just going through the motions of having a life. Except for when she was at the club playing tennis or at work in the operating room, she usually felt numb. A few years earlier, she'd found that she could relieve her numbness by scratching herself with a razor blade, but she had become frightened when she found that she was cutting herself more and more deeply and more often to get relief. She had tried alcohol too, but that reminded her of her dad and his out-of-control drinking, which made her feel disgusted with herself. So instead, she played tennis fanatically whenever she could. That made her feel alive. When I asked her about her past, Marilyn said she guessed that she must have had a happy childhood, but she could remember very little from before age 12. She told me she'd been a timid adolescent until she had a violent confrontation with her alcoholic father when she was 16 and ran away from home. She worked her way through community college and went on to get a degree in nursing without any help from her parents. She felt ashamed that during this time she'd slept around, which she described as looking for love in all the wrong places. As I often did with new patients, I asked her to draw a family portrait, and when I saw her drawing reproduced above, I decided to go slowly. Clearly, Marilyn was harboring some terrible memories, but she could not allow herself to recognize what her own picture revealed. She had drawn a wild and terrified child, trapped in some kind of cage and threatened, not only by 3 nightmarish figures, one with no eyes, but also by a huge erect penis protruding into her space. And yet this woman said she must have had a happy childhood. As the poet W.H. Auden wrote, "Truth, like love and sleep, resents approaches that are too intense." I call this Auden's rule, and in keeping with it, I deliberately did not push Marilyn to tell me what she remembered. In fact, I've learned that it's not important for me to know every detail of a patient's trauma. What is critical is that the patients themselves learn to tolerate feeling what they feel and knowing what they know. This may take weeks or even years. I decided to start Marilyn's treatment by inviting her to join an established therapy group where she could find support and acceptance before facing the engine of her distrust, shame, and rage. As I expected, Marilyn arrived at the first group meeting looking terrified, much like the girl in her family portrait. She was withdrawn and did not reach out to anybody. I'd chosen this group for her because its members had always been helpful and accepting of new members who were too scared to talk. They knew from their own experience that unlocking secrets is a gradual process. But this time they surprised me, asking so many intrusive questions about Marilyn's love life that I recalled her drawing of the little girl under assault. It was almost as though Marilyn had unwittingly enlisted the group to repeat her traumatic past. I intervened to help her set some boundaries about what she'd talk about, and she began to settle in. 3 months later, Marilyn told the group that she had stumbled and fallen a few times on the sidewalk between the subway and my office. She worried that her eyesight was beginning to fail. She'd also been missing a lot of tennis balls recently. I thought again about her drawing and the wild child with the huge, terrified eyes. Was this some sort of conversion reaction in which patients express their conflicts by losing function in some part of their body? Many soldiers in both world wars had suffered paralysis that couldn't be traced to physical injuries, and I had seen cases of hysterical blindness in Mexico and India. Still, as a physician, I wasn't about to conclude without further assessment that this was all in her head. I referred her to colleagues at the Massachusetts Eye and Ear Infirmary and asked them to do a very thorough workup. Several weeks later, the tests came back. Marilyn had lupus erythematosus of her retina, an autoimmune disease that was eroding her vision, and she would need immediate treatment. I was appalled. Marilyn was the 3rd person that year who I'd suspected of having an incest history, and who was then diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, a disease in which the body starts attacking itself. After making sure that Marilyn was getting the proper medical care, I consulted with 2 of my colleagues at Massachusetts General, psychiatrist Scott Wilson and Richard Cradden, who ran the immunology laboratory there. I told them Marilyn's story, showed them the picture she'd drawn, and asked them to collaborate on a study. They generously volunteered their time and the considerable expense of a full immunology workup. We recruited 12 women with incest histories who were not taking any medications, plus 12 women who had never been traumatized and who also did not take meds, a surprisingly difficult control group to find. Marilyn was not in the study. We generally do not ask our clinical patients to be part of our research efforts. When the study was completed and the data analyzed, Rich reported that the group of incest survivors had abnormalities in their CD45 RA to RL ratio compared with their non-traumatized peers. CD45 cells are the memory cells of the immune system. Some of them, called RA cells, have been activated by past exposure to toxins. They quickly respond to environmental threats they have encountered before. The RO cells, in contrast, are kept in reserve for new challenges. They are turned on to deal with threats the body has not met previously. The RA to RL ratio is the balance between cells that recognize known toxins and cells that wait for new information to activate. In patients with histories of incest, the proportion of RA cells that are ready to pounce is larger than normal. This makes the immune system oversensitive to threat, so that it is prone to mount a defense when none is needed, even when this means attacking the body's own cells. Our studies showed that, on a deep level, the bodies of incest victims have trouble distinguishing between danger and safety. This means that the imprint of past trauma does not consist only of distorted perceptions of information coming from the outside. The organism itself also has a problem knowing how to feel safe. The past is impressed not only on their minds and in misinterpretations of innocuous events, as when Marilyn attacked Michael because he accidentally touched her in her sleep, but also on the very core of their beings, in the safety of their bodies. A torn map of the world. How do people learn what is safe and what is not safe, what is inside and what is outside, what should be resisted and what can safely be taken in? The best way we can understand the impact of child abuse and neglect is to listen to what people like Marilyn can teach us. One of the things that became clear as I came to know her better was that she had her own unique view of how the world functions. As children, we start off at the center of our own universe, where we interpret everything that happens from an egocentric vantage point. If our parents or grandparents keep telling us we're the cutest, most delicious thing in the world, we don't question their judgment. We must be exactly that. And deep down, no matter what else we learn about ourselves, we will carry that sense with us, that we are basically adorable. As a result, if we later hook up with somebody who treats us badly, we will be outraged. It won't feel right, it's not familiar, it's not like home. But if we are abused or ignored in childhood, or grow up in a family where sexuality is treated with disgust, our inner map contains a different message. Our sense of ourself is marked by contempt and humiliation, and we are more likely to think he or she has my number and fail to protest if we are mistreated. Marilyn's past shaped her view of every relationship. She was convinced that men didn't give a damn about other people's feelings, and then they got away with whatever they wanted. Women couldn't be trusted either. They were too weak to stand up for themselves, and they'd sell their bodies to get men to take care of them. If you were in trouble, they wouldn't lift a finger to help you. This worldview manifested itself in the way Marilyn approached her colleagues at work. She was suspicious of the motives of anyone who was kind to her and called them on the slightest deviation from the nursing regulations. As for herself, she was a bad seed, a fundamentally toxic person who made bad things happen to those around her. When I first encountered patients like Marilyn, I used to challenge their thinking and try to help them see the world in a more positive, flexible way. One day, a woman named Kathy set me straight. A group member had arrived late to a session because her car had broken down, and Kathy immediately blamed herself. "I saw how rickety your car was last week. I knew I should have offered you a ride." Her self-criticism escalated to the point that, only a few minutes later, she was taking responsibility for her sexual abuse. I brought it on myself. I was 7 years old and I loved my daddy. I wanted him to love me, and I did what he wanted me to do. It was my own fault. When I intervened to reassure her, saying, "Come on, you are just a little girl. It was your father's responsibility to maintain the boundaries," Kathy turned toward me. "You know, Bessel," she said, "I know how important it is for you to be a good therapist, so when you make stupid comments like that, I usually thank you profusely. After all, I am an incest survivor. I was trained to take care of the needs of grown-up, insecure men, but after 2 years, I trust you enough to tell you that those comments make me feel terrible. Yes, it's true, I instinctively blame myself for everything bad that happens to the people around me. I know that isn't rational, and I feel really dumb for feeling this way, but I do. When you try to talk me into being more reasonable, I only feel even more lonely and isolated, and it confirms the feeling that nobody in the whole world will ever understand what it feels like to be me." I genuinely thanked her for her feedback, and I've tried ever since not to tell my patients that they should not feel the way they do. Kathy taught me that my responsibility goes much deeper. I have to help them reconstruct their inner map of the world. As I discussed in the previous chapter, attachment researchers have shown that our earliest caregivers don't only feed us, dress us, and comfort us when we are upset, they shape the way our rapidly growing brain perceives reality. Our interactions with our caregivers convey what is safe and what is dangerous, whom we can count on and who will let us down, what we need to do to get our needs met. This information is embodied in the warp and woof of our brain circuitry and forms the template of how we think of ourselves and the world around us. These inner maps are remarkably stable across time. This doesn't mean, however, that our maps can't be modified by experience. A deep love relationship, particularly during adolescence, when the brain once again goes through a period of exponential change, truly can transform us. So can the birth of a child, as our babies often teach us how to love. Adults who were abused or neglected as children can still learn the beauty of intimacy and mutual trust, or have a deep spiritual experience that opens them to a larger universe. In contrast, previously uncontaminated childhood maps can become so distorted by an adult rape or assault that all roads are rerouted into terror or despair. These responses are not reasonable and therefore cannot be changed simply by reframing irrational beliefs. Our maps of the world are encoded in the emotional brain, and changing them means having to reorganize that part of the central nervous system, the subject of the treatment section of this book. Nonetheless, learning to recognize irrational thoughts and behavior can be a useful first step. People like Marilyn often discover that their assumptions are not the same as those of their friends. If they are lucky, their friends and colleagues will tell them in words rather than in actions that their distrust and self-hatred make collaboration difficult. But that rarely happens, and Marilyn's experience was typical. After she assaulted Michael, he had absolutely no interest in working things out, and she lost both his friendship and her favorite tennis partner. It is at this point that smart and courageous people like Marilyn, who maintain their curiosity and determination in the face of repeated defeats, start looking for help. Generally, the rational brain can override the emotional brain as long as our fears don't hijack us. For example, your fear of being flagged down by the police can turn instantly to gratitude when the cop warns you that there's an accident ahead. But the moment we feel trapped, enraged, or rejected, we are vulnerable to activating old maps and to follow their directions. Change begins when we learn to own our emotional brains. That means learning to observe and tolerate the heartbreaking and gut-wrenching sensations that register misery and humiliation. Only after learning to bear what is going on inside can we start to befriend, rather than obliterate, the emotions that keep our maps fixed and immutable. Learning to remember. About a year into Marilyn's group, another member, Mary, asked permission to talk about what had happened to her when she was 13 years old. Mary worked as a prison guard, and she was involved in a sadomasochistic relationship with another woman. She wanted the group to know her background in the hope that they would become more tolerant of her extreme reactions, such as her tendency to shut down or blow up, in response to the slightest provocation. Struggling to get the words out, Mary told us that one evening, when she was 13 years old, she was raped by her older brother and a gang of his friends. The rape resulted in pregnancy, and her mother gave her an abortion at home on the kitchen table. The group sensitively tuned into what Mary was sharing and comforted her through her sobbing. I was profoundly moved by their empathy. They were consoling Mary in a way that they must have wished somebody had comforted them when they first confronted their traumas. When time ran out, Marilyn asked if she could take a few more minutes to talk about what she had experienced during the session. The group agreed, and she told us, "Hearing that story, I wonder if I may have been sexually abused myself. My mouth must have dropped open. Based on her family drawing, I had always assumed that she was aware, at least on some level, that this was the case. She had reacted like an incest victim in her response to Michael, and she chronically behaved as if the world were a terrifying place. Yet even though she'd drawn a girl who was being sexually molested, she, or at least her cognitive verbal self, had no idea what had actually happened to her. Her immune system, her muscles, and her fear system all had kept the score, but her conscious mind lacked a story that could communicate the experience. She reenacted her trauma in her life, but she had no narrative to refer to. As we will see in Chapter 12, traumatic memory differs in complex ways from normal recall, and it involves many layers of mind and brain. Triggered by Mary's story and spurred on by the nightmares that followed, Marilyn began individual therapy with me in which she started to deal with her past. At first, she experienced waves of intense, free-floating terror. She tried stopping for several weeks, but when she found she could no longer sleep and had to take time off from work, she continued our sessions. As she told me later, my only criterion for whether a situation is harmful is feeling, "This is going to kill me if I don't get out." I began to teach Marilyn calming techniques, such as focusing on breathing deeply, in and out, at 6 breaths a minute, while following the sensations of the breath in her body. This was combined with tapping acupressure points, which helped her not to become overwhelmed. We also worked on mindfulness, learning to keep her mind alive while allowing her body to feel the feelings that she had come to dread slowly enabled Marilyn to stand back and observe her experience rather than being immediately hijacked by her feelings. She had tried to dampen or abolish those feelings with alcohol and exercise, but now she began to feel safe enough to begin to remember what had happened to her as a girl. As she gained ownership over her physical sensations, she also began to be able to tell the difference between past and present. Now if she felt someone's leg brush against her in the night, she might be able to recognize it as Michael's leg, the leg of the handsome tennis partner she'd invited to her apartment. That leg did not belong to anyone else, and its touch didn't mean someone was trying to molest her. Being still enabled her to know, fully, physically know, that she was a 34-year-old woman and not a little girl. When Marilyn finally began to access her memories, they emerged as flashbacks of the wallpaper in her childhood bedroom. She realized that this was what she had focused on when her father raped her when she was 8 years old. His molestation had scared her beyond her capacity to endure, so she had needed to push it out of her memory bank. After all, she had to keep living with this man, her father, who had assaulted her. Marilyn remembered having turned to her mother for protection, but when she ran to her and tried to hide herself, by burying her face in her mother's skirt, she was met with only a limp embrace. At times her mother remained silent, at others she cried or angrily scolded Marilyn for making Daddy so angry. The terrified child found no one to protect her, to offer strength or shelter. As Roland Summit wrote in his classic study, The Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome, initiation, intimidation, stigmatization, isolation, helplessness, and self-blame depend on a terrifying reality of child sexual abuse. Any attempts by the child to divulge the secret will be countered by an adult conspiracy of silence and disbelief. Don't worry about things like that. That could never happen in our family. How could you ever think of such a terrible thing? Don't let me ever hear you say anything like that again. The average child never asks and never tells. After 40 years of doing this work, I still regularly hear myself saying, "That's unbelievable," when patients tell me about their childhoods. They are often as incredulous as I am. How could parents inflict such torture and terror on their own child? Part of them continues to insist that they must have made the experience up or that they are exaggerating. All of them are ashamed about what happened to them, and they blame themselves. On some level, they firmly believe that these terrible things were done to them because they are terrible people. Marilyn now began to explore how the powerless child had learned to shut down and comply with whatever was asked of her. She had done so by making herself disappear. The moment she heard her father's footsteps in the corridor outside her bedroom, she would put her head in the clouds. Another patient of mine who had a similar experience made a drawing that depicts how that process works. When her father started to touch her, she made herself disappear. She floated up to the ceiling, looking down on some other little girl in the bed. She was glad that it was not really her. It was some other girl who was being molested. Looking at these heads separated from their bodies by an impenetrable fog really opened my eyes to the experience of dissociation, which is so common among incest victims. Marilyn herself later realized that, as an adult, she had continued to float up to the ceiling when she found herself in a sexual situation. In that period when she'd been more sexually active, a partner would occasionally tell her how amazing she'd been in bed, that he'd barely recognized her, that she'd even talked differently. Usually she did not remember what had happened, but at other times she'd become angry and aggressive. She had no sense of who she really was sexually, so she gradually withdrew from dating altogether until Michael. Hating your home. Children have no choice who their parents are, nor can they understand that parents may simply be too depressed, enraged, or spaced out to be there for them, or that their parents' behavior may have little to do with them. Children have no choice but to organize themselves to survive within the families they have. Unlike adults, they have no other authorities to turn to for help. Their parents are the authorities. They cannot rent an apartment or move in with someone else. Their very survival hinges on their caregivers. Children sense, even if they are not explicitly threatened, that if they talked about their beatings or molestation to teachers, they would be punished. Instead, they focus their energy on not thinking about what has happened and not feeling the residues of terror and panic in their bodies. Because they cannot tolerate knowing what they have experienced, they also cannot understand that their anger, terror, or collapse has anything to do with that experience. They don't talk, they act and deal with their feelings by being enraged, shut down, compliant, or defiant. Children are also programmed to be fundamentally loyal to their caretakers, even if they are abused by them. Terror increases the need for attachment. even if the source of comfort is also the source of terror. I have never met a child below the age of 10 who was tortured at home and who had broken bones and burned skin to show for it, who, if given the option, would not have chosen to stay with his or her family rather than being placed in a foster home. Of course, clinging to one's abuser is not exclusive to childhood. Hostages have put up bail for their captors, expressed a wish to marry them, or had sexual relations with them. Victims of domestic violence often cover up for their abusers. Judges often tell me how humiliated they feel when they try to protect victims of domestic violence by issuing restraining orders, only to find out that many of them secretly allow their partners to return. It took Marilyn a long time before she was ready to talk about her abuse. She was not ready to violate her loyalty to her family. Deep inside, she felt that she still needed them to protect her against her fears. The price of this loyalty is unbearable feelings of loneliness, despair, and the inevitable rage of helplessness. Rage that has nowhere to go is redirected against the self in the form of depression, self-hatred, and self-destructive actions. One of my patients told me, "It is like hating your home, your kitchen and pots and pans, your bed, your chairs, your table, your rugs. Nothing feels safe, least of all your own body." Learning to trust is a major challenge. One of my other patients, a school teacher whose grandfather raped her repeatedly before she was 6, sent me the following email. "I started mulling the danger of opening up with you in traffic on the way home after our therapy appointment, and then as I merged into Route 124, I realized that I had broken the rule of not getting attached to you and to my students." During our next meeting, she told me she had also been raped by her lab instructor in college. I asked her whether she had sought help and made a complaint against him. "I couldn't make myself cross the road to the clinic," she replied. "I was desperate for help, but as I stood there, I felt very deeply that I would only be hurt even more." And that might well have been true. Of course, I had to hide what had happened from my parents and from everyone else. After I told her that I was concerned about what was going on with her, she wrote me another email. "I'm trying to remind myself that I didn't do anything to deserve such treatment. I don't think I have ever had anyone look at me like that and say they were worried about me, and I am holding on to it like a treasure. The idea that I'm worth being worried about by someone I respect and who does understand how deeply I'm struggling now. In order to know who we are, to have an identity, we must know, or at least feel that we know, what is and what is real. We must observe what we see around us and label it correctly. We must also be able to trust our memories and be able to tell them apart from our imagination. Losing the ability to make these distinctions is one sign of what psychoanalyst William Niederland called soul murder. Erasing awareness and cultivating denial are often essential to survival, but the price is that you lose track of who you are, of what you are feeling, and of what and whom you can trust. Replaying the trauma. One memory of Marilyn's childhood trauma came to her in a dream in which she felt as if she were being choked and was unable to breathe. A white tea towel was wrapped around her hands, and then she was lifted up with the towel around her neck so that she could not touch the ground with her feet. She woke in a panic, thinking that she was surely going to die. Her dream reminded me of the nightmares war veterans had reported to me, seeing the precise, unadulterated images of faces and body parts they had encountered in battle. These dreams were so terrifying that they tried to not fall asleep at night. Only daytime napping, which was not associated with nocturnal ambushes, felt halfway safe. During this stage of therapy, Marilyn was repeatedly flooded with images and sensations related to the choking dream. She remembered sitting in the kitchen as a 4-year-old with swollen eyes, a sore neck, and a bloody nose, while her father and brother laughed at her and called her a stupid, stupid girl. One day, Marilyn reported, "As I was brushing my teeth last evening, I was overcome with feelings of thrashing around. I was like a fish out of water, violently turning my body as I fought against the lack of air. I sobbed and choked as I brushed my teeth. Panic was rising up out of my chest with the feeling of thrashing. I had to use every bit of strength I had not to scream, 'No, no, 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 no,' as I stood over the sink." She went to bed and fell asleep, but woke up like clockwork every 2 hours during the rest of the night. Trauma is not stored as a narrative with an orderly beginning, middle, and end. As I'll discuss in detail in chapters 11 and 12, memories initially return as they did for Marilyn, as flashbacks that contain fragments of the experience. isolated images, sounds, and body sensations that initially have no context other than fear and panic. When Marilyn was a child, she had no way of giving voice to the unspeakable, and it would have made no difference anyway. Nobody was listening. Like so many survivors of childhood abuse, Marilyn exemplified the power of the life force, the will to live and to own one's life, the energy that counteracts the annihilation of trauma. I gradually came to realize that the only thing that makes it possible to do the work of healing trauma is awe at the dedication to survival that enabled my patients to endure their abuse and then to endure the dark nights of the soul that inevitably occur on the road to recovery. Chapter 9. What's love got to do with it? Initiation, intimidation, stigmatization, isolation, helplessness, and self-blame depend on a terrifying reality of child sexual abuse. Don't worry about things like that. That could never happen in our family. How could you ever think of such a terrible thing? Don't let me ever hear you say anything like that again. The average child never asks and never tells. Roland Summit, The Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome. How do we organize our thinking with regard to individuals like Marilyn, Mary, and Kathy, and what can we do to help them? The way we define their problems, our diagnosis, will determine how we approach their care. Such patients typically receive 5 or 6 different unrelated diagnoses in the course of their psychiatric treatment. If their doctors focus on their mood swings, they will be identified as bipolar and prescribed lithium or valproate. If the professionals are most impressed with their despair, they will be told they are suffering from major depression and given antidepressants. If the doctors focus on their restlessness and lack of attention, they may be categorized as ADHD and treated with Ritalin or other stimulants. And if the clinic staff happens to take a trauma history and the patient actually volunteers the relevant information, he or she might receive the diagnosis of PTSD. None of these diagnoses will be completely off the mark, and none of them will begin to meaningfully describe who these patients are and what they suffer from. Psychiatry, as a subspecialty of medicine, aspires to define mental illness as precisely as, let's say, cancer of the pancreas or streptococcal infection of the lungs. However, given the complexity of mind, brain, and human attachment systems, we have not come even close to achieving that sort of precision. Understanding what is wrong with people currently is more a question of the mindset of the practitioner and of what insurance companies will pay for than of verifiable objective facts. The first serious attempt to create a systematic manual of psychiatric diagnoses occurred in 1980 with the release of the 3rd edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the official list of all mental diseases recognized by the American Psychiatric Association, APA. The preamble to the DSM-3 warned explicitly that its categories were insufficiently precise to be used in forensic settings or for insurance purposes. Nonetheless, it gradually became an instrument of enormous power. Insurance companies require a DSM diagnosis for reimbursement. Until recently, all research funding was based on DSM diagnoses, and academic programs are organized around DSM categories. DSM labels quickly found their way into the larger culture as well. Millions of people know that Tony Soprano suffered from panic attacks and depression, and that Carrie Matheson of Homeland struggles with bipolar disorder. The manual has become a virtual industry that has earned the American Psychiatric Association well over $100 million. The question is, has it provided comparable benefits for the patients it is meant to serve? A psychiatric diagnosis has serious consequences. Diagnosis informs treatment, and getting the wrong treatment can have disastrous effects. Also, a diagnostic label is likely to attach to people for the rest of their lives and have a profound influence on how they define themselves. I've met countless patients who told me that they are bipolar or borderline, or that they have PTSD, as if they have been sentenced to remain in an underground dungeon for the rest of their lives, like the Count of Monte Cristo. None of these diagnoses takes into account the unusual talents that many of our patients develop, or the creative energies they have mustered to survive. All too often, diagnoses are mere tallies of symptoms, leaving patients such as Marilyn, Kathy, and Mary likely to be viewed as out-of-control women who need to be straightened out. The dictionary defines diagnosis as a. The act or process of identifying or determining the nature and cause of a disease or injury through evaluation of patient history, examination, and review of laboratory data. B. The opinion derived from such an evaluation. In this chapter and the next, I will discuss the chasm between official diagnoses and what our patients actually suffer from, and discuss how my colleagues and I have tried to change the way patients with chronic trauma histories are diagnosed. How do you take a trauma history? In 1985, I started to collaborate with psychiatrist Judith Herman, whose first book, Father-Daughter Incest, had recently been published. We were both working at Cambridge Hospital, one of Harvard's teaching hospitals, and, sharing an interest in how trauma had affected the lives of our patients, we began to meet regularly and compare notes. We were struck by how many of our patients who were diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, BPD, told us horror stories about their childhoods. BPD is marked by clinging but highly unstable relationships, extreme mood swings, and self-destructive behavior, including self-mutilation and repeated suicide attempts. In order to uncover whether there was, in fact, a relationship between childhood trauma and BPD, we designed a formal scientific study and sent off a grant proposal to the National Institutes of Health. It was rejected. Undeterred, Judy and I decided to finance the study ourselves, and we found an ally in Chris Perry, the director of research at Cambridge Hospital, who was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health to study BPD and other near-neighbor diagnoses, so-called personality disorders, in patients recruited from the Cambridge Hospital. He had collected volumes of valuable data on these subjects, but had never inquired about childhood abuse and neglect. Even though he did not hide his skepticism about our proposal, he was very generous to us and arranged for us to interview 55 patients from the hospital's outpatient department, and he agreed to compare our findings with records in the large database he had already collected. The first question Judy and I faced was, how do you take a trauma history? You can't ask a patient point blank, were you molested as a kid? Or did your father beat you up? How many would trust a complete stranger with such delicate information? Keeping in mind that people universally feel ashamed about the traumas they have experienced, we designed an interview instrument, the Traumatic Antecedents Questionnaire, TAQ. The interview started with a series of simple questions. Where do you live and who do you live with? Who pays the bills and who does the cooking and cleaning? It progressed gradually to more revealing questions. Who do you rely on in your daily life? As in, when you're sick, who does the shopping or takes you to the doctor? Who do you talk to when you are upset? In other words, who provides you with emotional and practical support? Some patients gave us surprising answers. My dog, or my therapist, or nobody. We then asked similar questions about their childhood. Who lived in the household? How often did you move? Who was your primary caretaker? Many of the patients reported frequent relocations that required them to change schools in the middle of the year. Several had primary caregivers who had gone to jail, been placed in a mental hospital, or joined the military. Others had moved from foster home to foster home or had lived with a string of different relatives. The next section of the questionnaire addressed childhood relationships. Who in your family was affectionate to you? Who treated you as a special person? This was followed by a critical question, one that, to my knowledge, had never before been asked in a scientific study. Was there anybody who you felt safe with growing up? 1 out of 4 patients we interviewed could not recall anyone they had felt safe with as a child. We checked nobody on our worksheets and did not comment, but we were stunned. Imagine being a child and not having a source of safety, making your way into the world unprotected and unseen. The questions continued. Who made the rules at home and enforced the discipline? How were kids kept in line? By talking, scolding, spanking, hitting, locking you up? How did your parents solve their disagreements? By then the floodgates had usually opened, and many patients were volunteering detailed information about their childhoods. One woman had witnessed her little sister being raped. Another told us she'd had her first sexual experience at age 8 with her grandfather. Men and women reported lying awake at night listening to furniture crashing and parents screaming. A young man had come down to the kitchen and found his mother lying in a pool of blood. Others talked about not being picked up at elementary school or coming home to find an empty house and spending the night alone. One woman who made her living as a cook had learned to prepare meals for her family after her mother was jailed on a drug conviction. Another had been 9 when she grabbed and steadied the car's steering wheel because her drunken mother was swerving down a 4-lane highway during rush hour. Our patients did not have the option to run away or escape. They had nobody to turn to and no place to hide, yet they somehow had to manage their terror and despair. They probably went to school the next morning and tried to pretend that everything was fine. Judy and I realized that the BPD group's problems, dissociation, desperate clinging to whoever might be enlisted to help, had probably started off as ways of dealing with overwhelming emotions and inescapable brutality. After our interviews, Judy and I met to code our patients' answers, that is, to translate them into numbers for computer analysis, and Chris Perry then collated them with the extensive information on these patients he had stored on Harvard's mainframe computer. One Saturday morning in April, he left us a message asking us to come to his office. There we found a huge stack of printouts, on top of which Chris had placed a Gary Larson cartoon of a group of scientists studying dolphins and being puzzled by those strange habla español sounds. The data had convinced him that unless you understand the language of trauma and abuse, you cannot really understand BPD. As we later reported in the American Journal of Psychiatry, 81% of the patients diagnosed with BPD at Cambridge Hospital reported severe histories of child abuse and/or neglect. In the vast majority, the abuse began before age 7. This finding was particularly important because it suggested that the impact of abuse depends, at least in part, on the age at which it begins. Later research by Martin Tector at McLean Hospital showed that different forms of abuse have different impacts on various brain areas at different stages of development. Although numerous studies have since replicated our findings, I still regularly get scientific papers to review that say things like, "It has been hypothesized that borderline patients may have histories of childhood trauma." When does a hypothesis become a scientifically established fact? Our study clearly supported the conclusions of John Bowlby. When children feel pervasively angry or guilty or are chronically frightened about being abandoned, they have come by such feelings honestly. That is because of experience. When, for example, children fear abandonment, it is not in counter-reaction to their intrinsic homicidal urges. Rather, it is more likely because they have been abandoned physically or psychologically, or have been repeatedly threatened with abandonment. When children are pervasively filled with rage, it is due to rejection or harsh treatment. When children experience intense inner conflict regarding their angry feelings, this is likely because expressing them may be forbidden or even dangerous. Bowlby noticed that when children must disown powerful experiences they have had, this creates serious problems, including chronic distrust of other people, inhibition of curiosity, distrust of their own senses, and the tendency to find everything unreal. As we will see, this has important implications for treatment. Our study expanded our thinking about the impact of particular horrendous events, the focus of the PTSD diagnosis, to look at the long-term effects of brutalization and neglect in caregiving relationships. It also raised another critical question. What therapies are effective for people with a history of abuse, particularly those who feel chronically suicidal and deliberately hurt themselves? Self-harm. During my training, I was called from my bed at around 3 a.m. 3 nights in a row to stitch up a woman who had slashed her neck with whatever sharp object she could lay her hands on. She told me, somewhat triumphantly, that cutting herself made her feel much better. Ever since then, I've asked myself why. Why do some people deal with being upset by playing 3 sets of tennis or drinking a stiff martini, while others carve their arms with razor blades? Our study showed that having a history of childhood sexual and physical abuse was a strong predictor of repeated suicidal attempts and self-cutting. I wondered if their suicidal ruminations had started when they were very young, and whether they had found comfort in plotting their escape by hoping to die or doing damage to themselves. Does inflicting harm on oneself begin as a desperate attempt to gain some sense of control? Chris Perry's database had followed up information on all the patients who were treated in the hospital's outpatient clinics, including reports on suicidality and self-destructive behavior. After 3 years of therapy, approximately 2/3 of the patients had markedly improved. Now the question was, which members of the group had benefited from therapy and which had continued to feel suicidal and self-destructive? Comparing the patient's ongoing behavior with our TAQ interviews provided some answers. The patients who remained self-destructive had told us that they did not remember feeling safe with anybody as a child. They had reported being abandoned, shuttled from place to place, and generally left to their own devices. I concluded that, if you carry a memory of having felt safe with somebody long ago, the traces of that earlier affection can be reactivated in attuned relationships when you are an adult, whether these occur in daily life or in good therapy. However, if you lack a deep memory of feeling loved and safe, the receptors in the brain that respond to human kindness may simply fail to develop. If that is the case, how can people learn to calm themselves down and feel grounded in their bodies? Again, this has important implications for therapy, and I'll return to this question throughout Part 5 on treatment. The power of diagnosis. Our study also confirmed that there was a traumatized population quite distinct from the combat soldiers and accident victims for whom the PTSD diagnosis had been created. People like Marilyn and Kathy, as well as the patients Judy and I had studied, and the kids in the outpatient clinic at MMHC that I described in Chapter 7, do not necessarily remember their traumas, one of the criteria for the PTSD diagnosis, or at least are not preoccupied with specific memories of their abuse, but they continue to behave as if they were still in danger. They go from one extreme to the other. They have trouble staying on task, and they continually lash out against themselves and others. To some degree, their problems do overlap with those of combat soldiers, but they are also very different in that their childhood trauma has prevented them from developing some of the mental capacities that adult soldiers possessed before their traumas occurred. After we realized this, a group of us went to see Robert Spitzer, who, after having guided the development of the DSM-3, was in the process of revising the manual. He listened carefully to what we told him. He told us it was likely that clinicians who spend their days treating a particular patient population are likely to develop considerable expertise in understanding what ails them. He suggested that we do a study, a so-called field trial, to compare the problems of different groups of traumatized individuals. Spitzer put me in charge of the project. First, we developed a rating scale that incorporated all the different trauma symptoms that had been reported in the scientific literature. Then we interviewed 525 adult patients at 5 sites around the country to see if particular populations suffered from different constellations of problems. Our populations fell into 3 groups: those with histories of childhood physical or sexual abuse by caregivers, recent victims of domestic violence, and people who had recently been through a natural disaster. There were clear differences among these groups, particularly those on the extreme ends of the spectrum, victims of child abuse and adults who had survived natural disasters. The adults who had been abused as children often had trouble concentrating, complained of always being on edge, and were filled with self-loathing. They had enormous trouble negotiating intimate relationships, often veering from indiscriminate, high-risk, and unsatisfying sexual involvements to total sexual shutdown. They also had large gaps in their memories, often engaged in self-destructive behaviors, and had a host of medical problems. These symptoms were relatively rare in the survivors of natural disasters. Each major diagnosis in the DSM had a work group responsible for suggesting revisions for the new edition. I presented the results of the field trial to our DSM-4 PTSD work group, and we voted 19-2 to create a new trauma diagnosis for victims of interpersonal trauma, disorders of extreme stress, not otherwise specified, DES-NOS, or complex PTSD for short. We then eagerly anticipated the publication of the DSM-4 in May 1994, but much to our surprise, the diagnosis that our work group had overwhelmingly approved did not appear in the final product. None of us had been consulted. This was a tragic exclusion. It meant that large numbers of patients could not be accurately diagnosed and that clinicians and researchers would be unable to scientifically develop appropriate treatments for them. You cannot develop a treatment for a condition that does not exist. Not having a diagnosis now confronts therapists with a serious dilemma. How do we treat people who are coping with the fallout of abuse, betrayal, and abandonment when we are forced to diagnose them with depression, panic disorder, bipolar illness, or borderline personality, which do not really address what they are coping with? The consequences of caretaker abuse and neglect are vastly more common and complex than the impact of hurricanes or motor vehicle accidents. Yet the decision makers who determine the shape of our diagnostic system decided not to recognize this evidence. To this day, after 20 years and 4 subsequent revisions, the DSM and the entire system based on it fail victims of child abuse and neglect. just as they ignored the plight of veterans before PTSD was introduced back in 1980. The hidden epidemic. How do you turn a newborn baby with all its promise and infinite capacities into a 30-year-old homeless drunk? As with so many great discoveries, internist Vincent Felitti came across the answer to this question accidentally.